Hi guys, I'm a part of the WeSearchZ dev team, and in this crash course I'm going to show you how to create a simple bookstore using Node.js, React and WeSearchZ. As you can see, there are all of these books and we can search. To follow along, you need Node.js and an IDE. In my case I'm using Visual Studio Code, and you need an account in WeSearchZ. That's all. Let's get started. I have already created the folder which will contain the project and have opened it in Visual Studio Code. Now I will create two folders, one for the front end of the application and one for the back end. I'm going to open the front end folder in a terminal and initialize the React project. While that's going, I'm going to initialize the backend project. Then I'm going to install the Express, Course and .env packages. Finally, I will install one more package, and that's going to be the NodeMon package. Now we can add a script for development to the backend to actually be able to run it. That's going to use NodeMon to start the app.js file in the source directory. Now I will create both the source directory and the app.js file. As you can see, the frontend has finished initializing. That's great. Let's delete all of these files because they are of no use to us. I'm also going to delete most of the code in the index.js file. Also, I prefer to rewrite the code here to be more expressive, but that's not really needed. For the app.js file, I'm going to remove the logo import and replace it with the returned HTML to a simple hello world. Finally, I'll rename the CSS file to lowercase app and create it. Let's test it now to see if it works. Yes, it does. Great. Now we can start working. First, I'm going to declare a function that's going to be called when the user searches for something. It's going to take a string as a parameter, and initially we're just going to console log it. Now I'm going to replace the HTML inside with a fragment tag because we will have multiple components inside. Then I'm going to add a navbar component that doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to create a components folder which will hold all components. There, I'm going to create a navbar folder, and inside I'm going to create a navbar.jsx file and a navbar CSS file. In the JSX file, I'll use a shortcut to create a basic component, and then I'll import the CSS file. Now, I can link the navbar component in the app.js file. And as you can see, it renders in the browser. Great. Now, we should pass the onSearch function to the navbar component because the text box used for searching will require it. It's time to write the HTML code for the navbar. That's going to be just a simple nav tag and inside of it a heading tag. The heading tag is going to be the name of the store, in this case bookz. Now it's time to start it. Display flags to order the items and a box shadow to add a little bit of contrast. Make sure the width is 100% and add a bit of padding. Finally, align the text and items to the center and make box sizing to border box. Now for the style of the heading, remove any padding and margin and set the font size to 35 pixels. Here I'm just going to add a gradient, which is not really needed. Alright, everything's fine. I'm going to change the font family of the entire page because this one doesn't fit well. That's better. It's time to add the search box. I'm going to create a new folder called search box, and inside I'm going to create the JSX and CSS files. I'll use the shortcut again and will import the CSS file. Now pass the onSearch function to the search box component. Replace the HTML code inside to a simple form with a class called search-box. Next, add an input field inside the form. Set its placeholder to type to search, then set its type to text. After that's finished, we should make a reference to the input field. Then create a function that handles the submit action of the form. The function should prevent the default behavior of the event. Pass it to the form and pass the reference to the input field. Finally, retrieve the value from the input field into a variable and pass the variable to the onSearch function. Now you can add the search box component to the navbar. And it works, but it doesn't look that good, so it's time to style the search box. First, set the font size to 14 pixels and the width to 300 pixels. Also set the margin to 0. Then for the input field, set the font size to inherit. That's just going to save us some code later in the video. Set the padding to 5 pixels and make the outline none. Next, add a border that is 2 pixels thick and has a border radius of 8 pixels. Finally, I'm going to set the width to 200 pixels and add a transition. Now for the focus of the input field, we want to change the width to 300 pixels and the color of the border. The search box now works as expected, but the positioning is wrong. Let's see what's wrong. The margin should be 0 and auto instead of just a 0. My mistake. Now everything works as expected, but it's not responsive. Go to the CSS of the navbar and add a media query. Change the flex direction of the navbar to column and the row gap to 10 pixels. Next, add a media query to the search box as well. Make the width to 90%. To make it even better, change the input field to have a width of 60%. And now it's responsive, great. But there is one problem. There is a little bit of padding. Let's fix it. This should fix all of our problems. And it did, there's no more excessive padding. Great. Now it's time to start making our products. First I'm going to add the folders product-list and product. I'm going to create the JSX and CSS files for the product list. I'll do the same for the product. Now let's create the actual components. Import the CSS file in the product list. Remove the contents of the div and add a class called product list to it. Now check if the list is available and map it to the product component. Pass a random key to the component and destructure the value provided by the map function. Now we should start making the product component. First I'm going to pass the ID, title, description, price and link of the product to the component. Then I'm going to format the title to display it with 3 dots if its length is greater than 14 characters. Now I'm going to replace the div tag with an A tag and I'm going to pass the link to it. I'm going to add a class name for later and make it use target blank. Inside I'm going to add an image tag. Its source is going to be based on the ID that is required by the component. Remember that the ID is a unique identifier for the product. Basically we are going to add the images to our assets folder and then set their names to our id.jpg. Next I'll add a paragraph containing the title. I actually forgot to import the CSS file, let's add it now. I also forgot to pass the list of products to the product list, my mistake. Let's now add the product list to the root of our app. Also we should pass the array of products. Now I'm going to create this list via the useState hook. Initially it's going to be an empty array. I didn't import React, let's do it now. Finally, to test it, I'm going to add some dummy data to the products array. We also need to add an image to the assets folder in our public directory. However, there is no assets folder, so let's create it now. Now I'm going to transfer an image to the assets folder and call it a.jpg. refresh the browser, and here it is. Now we just have to style the product component. We will use the product class. Make it display flex and change its flex direction to column. Center the text and its contents. Then add a box sizing of border box. Next add a border radius and a border. Following that, set the width and the padding. Then remove any text decoration and set the color. Finally, add a transition. That's all for this class. Great. Now let's style the image tag. Remove any padding and margin. Set the width to 100%. Now we have to style the paragraph tag. Set the padding and remove the margin. Now let's change the color of the product when hovered. And finally, let's change its color when active. And it's working as it's supposed to, great. Let's now style the product list. Make it display flex and set the direction to row. Then make flex wrap to wrap. Add a row gap and a column gap of 10 pixels. And finally add padding and center row children. And the product list is working, great. However, there's a slight issue. The product doesn't have any border. The issue is that I actually forgot to add a P in PX. And now it's better, great. Finally, we have to start adding products to WeSearchZ. First, create an account. I already have one, so I'm going to skip this step. Then go to the dashboard. I have already created a project and have already added products to it, but I'm going to delete this book 1984 and add it again just to show you how it all works. Now go to add product. Set the title of the product. Mine is going to be 1984. Set the price. I'm going to use the price listed on Amazon. And I'm going to use the description from Amazon. Next, provide a link. In my case, I'm going to give the link to the Amazon page, but you can give whatever link you want. Now that we have added a product, we can use the ID provided to us by WeSearchZ to name the image file. I loaded some images in the folder off camera. Their names correspond to their WeSearchZ IDs. We just need to change the old ID of 1984 to the new one. Now we can delete the example product from app.js. Let's now move to the connection between our frontend and WeSearchZ. Go to the backend folder and open the app.js file there. First, load the .env file. Then load Express and the course. Now create the .env file that's going to be loaded. Note that this file is not in the source directory but the root directory of the backend. We're going to use the following variables. WeSearchZ API URL, and that's going to be the URL for the API of WeSearchZ. Then WeSearchZ project ID, which we're going to populate in a bit. And finally WeSearchZ API key, which we're also going to populate in a bit. Now we can go and grab these values from WeSearchZ. The project ID can be found right under the name of the project. Paste that to the second key. And then for the API key we can grab it from here. Paste that to the third key. And that's all for our .env file. I'm now going to declare the variables in the code and get them from our .env file. I'm also going to declare the app and get that from Express. Next I'm going to add a course middleware. And finally I'm going to create the endpoint that's going to be used for searching. Let's now make Express listen to a given port. Now it's time to implement our search endpoint. Since we're going to receive the search data via query parameters, we should make it in a string form. Then we should create the URL we're going to use for searching. And that's going to be the WeSearchZ URL, /API, /search, and then the project ID equal to the already specified one. We can see the query parameters that are required in the API documentation that can be found on the home page. As you can see, the project ID is required. Now back to the code. Let's check if any query parameters have been passed. If that's true, we are going to attach them to the URL. Now let's use the fetch API. First pass the URL and then let's give it a configuration. The method is get and there's an authorization header. For this, we are going to pass the API key as a bearer. In case a response is returned, we should check whether the status code is 200. If it's not, we are going to return status 400 and a simple message. I'm also going to print an error, but you can skip that. And finally, return. However, if the status is 200, we shall parse the response as JSON. And inside we should send a response of 200 and the date. In case the body cannot be parsed as JSON, we shall send a response of 400 and an error. I'm going to print it again. And we can copy that catch for the fetch API. Now let's run it. It says that the port is undefined. That's because I actually forgot to add a port variable in the .env file. My mistake. I'm going to set it to 3001. Now everything should be fine. Let's run it again. And it works, great. Let's connect our backend to the frontend. First, go to the app.js file and declare a state that reflects whether there's any data being loaded or not. Initially, that's going to be true. If there's any data being loaded, render the navbar. Let's create a component that will render a text on the screen. I forgot to do that earlier, so I'm going to do it now. I'm going to call it full screen text. Inside the folder, I'm going to create the JSX and CSS files. Then again, I'm going to use the shortcut to create the basic layout for the component. And I'm going to import the CSS file as well. Now I'm just going to pass the text that's going to be rendered as a parameter. Then I'm just going to add the class for the div. And inside I'm going to put a paragraph containing the text. Now it's time to write some CSS. It's going to be applied to the div. The display is going to be flex and the width 100%. Then flex grow is a 1, justify content is center, and finally the text align is also center. Next is the paragraph inside the div. For that, just set the font size to 36 pixels and the margin to auto. That's all. Now we can use the full screen text component in the app.js. The text that's going to be rendered is loading and 3 dots. We'll have to wrap all of that in a fragment. And now we'll use it at one more place. That's going to be here. It will first check whether there are any products loaded, and if there are, we will render the product list. If there are no products, we will render a full screen text component displaying the information. And now that that's done, we shall see how it all looks. It looks fine. Great. Now let's finally start coding the last piece of the puzzle, the onSearch function. First, set the loading state to true. Then define the URL that's going to be queried, in our case the backend, so localhost 3001. We're going to use the search endpoint, so add a /API/search. Next, check whether the provided query is null or empty. If it's not, append it as a title and a description. Next, provide the URL to the fetch API and specify a method get. If it returns a response without any problems, check whether the status is 200. If it's not, I'm going to print an error to the console. Then set the loading state to false and return. Now we should parse the response as JSON. If it can successfully parse it, set the product to data.hits and the loading state to false. However, if it fails, I'm going to print the error and then set the loading state to false again. And now you can copy that catch to the fetch API. And now just call the onSearch function with an empty string for the initial load of the products. And finally, it all works. As you can see, our books are being loaded from WeSearchZ and displayed here. I can click them and it will take me to the respective link. I can also search for specific words. and it can take me back to the list of all products. So this concludes this crash course. We just finished a very simple bookshop using Node.js, React, and WeSearchZ. I hope it was useful to you, and see you in the next one. Bye!